I see this come up time and time again in the comments. Which game is better? I prefer this one, or The Division sucks, they should have just updated The Division 1. I'd originally left this because there are already a ton of videos out there, from quite early on, and all tend to be skewed in one direction. But now in its third year, it seems like a better time to look at it, from my point of view anyway, as I keep getting asked about my thoughts around this. So I thought, why not? I need to stress before I get into anything that I enjoy both the Division 1 and the Division 2, but for very different reasons. Having said that, after playing both games extensively, there is only one that I still consistently jump into, and unless I need to grab some footage, I tend not to play the other, and I don't see this changing anytime soon. This video breakdown isn't going to be based on player numbers or any potential updates in the future. It will be built purely on the current state of each game today. And another important factor to keep in mind is that I'll be basing this on what I look for and enjoy in a game, and I most certainly don't think that my view will match everyone else's. For example, in this video I'll be running through the following, and for me, these are probably the most important ones for my experience. It's not that I don't like PvP, it's just that I've never really been a fan of Division PvP, and whenever I have that PvP itch, I usually jump into Siege or Destiny, but I'll discuss that a bit later. What I'm trying to say is that it's very subjective to each individual as to what can make a game enjoyable, and that this is simply my take on the two games. I put a fair amount of time into the Division 1 recently, so I can more accurately compare the two games. In doing this sort of video, I was particularly concerned about the movement aspect, as often you'll grow so used to one game, the other one will always feel a bit off. So I put a number of hours into each game, crossing back and forth between the two, but my initial thoughts stayed the same. I remember when I first tried out the Division 2, the character movement felt a little heavy in comparison, but as you'd expect, you get used to it pretty quick. The idea behind this change was to allow for a more realistic feel. The character is carrying a lot of gear after all. Fortunately, unlike some other games I can think of, they don't overdo it. Going back to the Division 1, you do feel a little more free, for lack of a better word. The character is light on their feet and super responsive. But overall, the movement in general, especially in and out of cover, feels a little clunky in comparison. Not game-breaking, just not as refined as the sequel. However, where the movement went in a more realistic direction, the weapon handling did the opposite. The Division 1 has considerably more weapon recoil, and I quite like this. It provided a greater point of difference between the weapon archetypes, and it gave me more to consider when playing around with builds. It also meant that attributes like handling and stability actually mattered, especially on console. However, this also provided more of a skill gap between new players and those who had learnt over time to compensate for the recoil, which is why I think they heavily reduced it. For the casual player, weapons being too difficult to handle becomes a quality of life issue. It also reduced the number of viable weapons on console for the average player. And then we have the infamous bullet sponge issue that a lot of people hated about the game. This is a looter shooter, and a large part of the game is around collecting loot and creating builds that work for your style of play. If every enemy could be killed with a single bullet to the head, the need for builds have effectively been removed. But stepping back from the Division 2 into the original, I had completely forgotten how many more bullets the enemies needed to be taken down. I can now appreciate the balance that has been put into the Division 2. Builds still matter, but the combat isn't so sluggish. This alone has made the game feel much faster paced than Division 1. Probably the biggest letdown people have with the Division 2 is the atmosphere. And I get it, the Division 1's dark, snowy streets with its tall buildings looming overhead really added to the impact of what had happened in the story. It felt lonely, cold, deserted, and is entirely fitting for a lawless, post-apocalyptic city, and all the hopeful twinkling Christmas lights and decorations only added to the somber reality of a Christmas that would never occur. Then there's the Division 2. While they did add some of the tall buildings and dirty streets with the addition of Warlords of New York, it just doesn't have the same gritty feeling and total immersion of the original. It's sunny, agents are running around in shorts, tank tops, and jandals or flip-flops or thongs depending on what part of the world you're from. But if you consider the direction they've taken with the story, it makes complete sense. In the Division 1, we're operating around a city only weeks after the outbreak, discovering what has really happened and who was responsible. In the Division 2, 7 months have passed. We've been through the worst of the virus, and it's now about helping those who have survived thus far in re-establishing order. So to be fair, the dark and snowy streets of New York probably wouldn't have fit into this change of narrative quite so well. However, with this new storyline that takes place in Washington DC, although not as immersive, is considerably more detailed than Manhattan. And on top of this, there is a lot more going on. This environment just feels more alive. I'm someone who enjoys open worlds, and a large part of this is because of the option to explore, to find hidden gems spotted around the map, to watch the NPCs go about their business. The best example of this being Ghost Recon. Although I have enjoyed both games, Wildlands just feels more natural and like there is more going on. It's more realistic and rough, whereas Breakpoint just feels a little dead. Plus, the open world activities only add to this. Rescuing civilians, capturing control points, ambushing supply routes. It's made roaming the streets an activity on its own. The Division 1 had years of balancing issues, with the current meta at the time, and that would change every patch or so, would be the only build worth running. It wasn't just a case of being slightly better, the meta builds would often outclass everything else in every way. It wasn't until about 1.7 from memory that the build diversity was in its best place. There were still some meta builds, but they weren't as overpowered as the previous ones. This was the time of the Ninja Bike Messenger builds, and going back, I actually think I started creating content around this time. Unfortunately, this was rather short-lived, as 1.8 and beyond brought classified sets to the table. I admit, I myself did like the more class style of play that these gave the game, but I didn't really like how the classified sets became the only thing to run. Other builds could work, but the classified bonuses were just too powerful, and so being creative with builds stopped being a thing. With the introduction of classified pieces, the game also became unrewarding, as the most efficient way of farming these was through the global events. So in its current form, I rate the Division 2 far higher when it comes to build diversity and post-game progression. As you make your way through the levels and eventually get to level 40, you can start putting together proper endgame builds immediately, where the Division 1 locks you into waiting on global events to acquire the best gear. Like I said earlier, I'm not really a huge fan of Division PvP. Previously, I used to spend a little bit of time in Last Stand, but it was hardly what I'd call a competitive experience. It was more for just a bit of fun, as a break from doing other things. However, with the Division 2, it isn't even just a bit of fun, it's just horrible. While the balance of PvE is in an okay place right now, the PvP is pretty much broken. Unless you're running one of the 2 to 3 relevant builds in there, you aren't going to be having a good time. To be fair, the build variety wasn't particularly amazing in the Division 1 either, but at least with game modes like Last Stand, you could join in the controlled chaos and have some fun, just based on the number of people alone. Incoming unpopular opinion, I don't think the Division franchise was ever made with PvP in mind, of it being one of the main activities in the game. And this idea is only further supported by what they did with it in the Division 2. Early on in the game's life cycle, I spent well over 1,000 hours roaming around the Division 1 Dark Zone. Not in a group, I was a solo player 95% of the time. I found it was one of the best places to farm, as you had a greater chance of finding high-end gear and set items, but there was also always a risk of having them taken from you by other agents. The Dark Zone was one of the first things that grabbed my attention when reading about the up-and-coming game. A high-risk, high-reward PvEvP area. I was more than happy to take the risk, and admittedly, it used to scare the crap out of me when I first started running it. But over time, the developers eventually conceded to the popular opinion across the community, and made it so that the Dark Zone was no longer the most efficient place to farm, effectively removing the incentive for going there in the first place. From then on, the bulk of the people who entered this area were groups of 4 looking for PvP. And of course I kept going in because I liked the challenge of playing as a solo player, either playing stealth or watching teams of 4 coming across me, thinking I was an easy target. However, I eventually changed over to PC, and without the reward, I just never bothered going back. And the Division 2 Dark Zones continued on with the same issue, except it got even worse. At first, I actually liked the idea of the smaller Dark Zones, increasing the chance of coming across other players, but it ended up changing the whole feel of the Dark Zone. After 20 minutes of running around, you realise how small these new dark zones really are. Completely inappropriate for solo players. Stealth was never going to be an option. And again, without any sort of incentive to go in there, they remain fairly unused. This would have to be one of the most important parts for this genre of game. For these mini MMO style games, it's important to have something to build towards well after the campaign has been completed. With the Division 1, we have incursions, PvP, Dark Zone, Underground, Survival, Resistance, and Legendary missions. The Division 2 has raids, PvP, Dark Zone, Summit, Open World activities, Legendary missions, and Seasons. Let's take away PvP in the Dark Zone because we've already talked about that. Underground, Survival, and Resistance are all completely separate, dedicated game modes. The only thing that the Division 2 has that could slightly resemble any of these is Summit, but this fell well short of the mark. The Summit feels like it was a rushed game mode that was quickly put together to silence some of the complaints that were happening at the time. And more importantly, from a story point of view, we're not even given a reason as to why we're climbing that building. Incursions were intended to be mini raids or long missions, but it didn't take long before people were able to speedrun these. In the Division 2 we got full raids. These were a nice addition that a large amount of the community still partake in, months after their release. But they're not really my cup of tea. I've run them, yes, but past the first couple of times I've found them get a little boring. I don't buy into the popular opinion of locking off content from the majority of the community. I'm a solo player too. I don't have a crew that I run with. I'm not even part of a clan. There are plenty of ways to find groups, and if you don't want to find a group, don't play it. You really aren't missing out on much as far as the raid loot goes. The only other difference that the Division 2 has over the Division 1 is open world activities and seasons. And although these feel pretty weak, the open world dynamic activities are still technically in-game. Seasons, however, I actually liked the addition of these. They certainly added to the reasons to sign in. But again, much like the raids, these should have never replaced other activities from being added to the game. They should have been in addition to them. For obvious reasons, this would be the main comparison that's brought to my attention. I think that the Division story is a fairly typical example of the sequel not quite having the same impact as the original. Examples of this are Anchorman 2, Pirates of the Caribbean, Matrix, Pitch Perfect, from what I've heard. The Division 1 introduces us to the story. It takes a decent amount of time to build the scene and set the mood. It was new and exciting. Where the Division 2 continues the story, it isn't a whole new story, it's the progression we've made from surviving towards rebuilding. I can't think of a way they could have had the same impact with the second game, given the way we're moving on from the initial virus scare. I do however think that the story feels a little more rushed in the Division 2. There is a lot going on in Washington, and because of this, I feel like we didn't get the same sort of depth that we had with the more linear storyline of the original. And this goes all the way down to the collectibles. There were a lot more side stories going on, missing agents, and other recordings that you could piece together to expand on the main story. However, there is one thing I'd love to see them continue doing. In the original game we were presented with the main storyline, and that was pretty much it. We had a few bits and pieces added when they opened up the West Side Pier, but nothing substantial. The Division 2 story has evolved over time. Where I think they went wrong is the way they did it through seasons. After the first Manhunt or two, a lot of people were sick of them and missed out on the future editions. The other thing is that they only did it through the collectibles, the comms. Most people would have preferred a cutscene or two. But I like the way they've continued on with the story. Although maybe not told the way everyone would like it, there has been a lot more happen than in the Division 1. However, I still don't forgive them for what they did with Aaron Keener. Speaking of which, this is another area that I've noticed people aren't a fan of. The twists and turns, the good guys turning bad. It seems that a lot of people would prefer a straightforward good guys versus bad guys story, where the Division, especially the Division 2, takes it from more of a the bad guys aren't completely bad, and the good aren't exactly good. I actually like this. It adds a bit more depth, makes it feel grittier. But having said all that, if I had to choose a favourite, it would be the way in which the first game was told. And to be fair, it would always be that way, regardless of how the Division 2 turned out, and however they tell the story in the future. The Division 1 is the thing that started it all. There is too much history there, and over time, the nostalgia will only grow. From a gameplay point of view, the Division 2 is smoother and a little more fast-paced. but when looking at the endgame, it's still quite far behind. The sequel has a number of quality of life additions that made the Division 1 feel a little bit of a chore, especially when it came to inventory and having to restock ammo one at a time. But the main thing that sets them apart is the PvP. It's like they haven't even bothered with it in the second game. To be fair, I saw the same complaints from the same people in the first game, but the Division 2 certainly didn't help calm the noise. Summing up, in my opinion, the Division 1 is more complete when it comes to game modes and endgame, but the Division 2 is better to play in almost every other aspect. So tell me, where do you stand with the two games? What do you like about each of them? Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!